Okay, Maxim, so this is our series around Ukraine. In this series, we discuss what is happening around Ukraine, what is happening in the international context. So let's maybe talk about the key topics in the past week. What you think were the most important ones?
So, of course, the most important one was the adoption of the resolution with regard to Ukraine by the UN General Assembly. We are also going to talk about the developments around China's peace settlement plan, so-called, about Ukraine, but also, on the other hand, about the rumors that China might deliver weapons to Russia. That is also important. We'll talk about the neighborhood of Ukraine, about what's going to happen or is already happening in Transnistria, about partisan warfare in Belarus. We're going to talk about the suspension of the START treaty by Russia and how it impacts Ukraine and the broader international picture. And also we're going to dwell on some of the insights that international press and foreign press has about how the West is seeing the conflict around Ukraine henceforth and how we might settle it.
Yeah, let's talk with this UN General Assembly resolution. On the one hand, we see the overwhelming support for Ukraine. We see very little number of countries which are against. Of course, these are mostly Russia allies. But we also see a big block of countries who are abstaining. And what is, in your opinion, what does this resolution signify?
Well, my major conclusion would be that maybe counter to some expectations, this resolution was more about the form and about continuity than it was about the essence, about some novelty in what was written down there. There again may have been some expectations about that, about the inclusion of the President Zelensky's peace plan, the 10 steps there. But generally, for the most part, the resolution was the repetition of the things that had already previously been said in the UN General Assembly, like the call for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine and the condemnation of the annexations, all those things. And so in this sense, the resolution has been a way to keep, so to say, the hand on the pulse, as we say in Ukraine, right, of what's happening in the perception of the entire world on Russia's war in Ukraine. That being said, this check-up of the perceptions of the world has proven that the support of Ukraine has not really become less. We have the 141 votes in favor of the resolution, and if I'm not mistaken, 34 abstentions, with seven, I guess, votes against it. The club of the countries who have voted against, apart from the usual suspects, it has been broadened by Mali and Nicaragua. Mali because of the Russian influence, domestic influence there, and Nicaragua because of its anti-Western stance generally. So I would say the bottom line is that the picture has not really changed much, which is good news for Ukraine, because all of this talks about the fatigue from Ukraine, they are not true just yet.
Okay, so let's talk in detail about these countries. 7 countries against: Russia, Syria, Nicaragua, Mali, Eritrea, Democratic Republic of Congo, Belarus. Yeah, this is it. 32 abstentions. What is important for us is, of course, that in this list of abstentions, there is China, there is India, there is Pakistan, there is South Africa. I think South Africa is very important. We see that there are attempts of Russian diplomacy to go to South Africa and to get the support of South Africa, at least neutrality. There is Uzbekistan, there is Zimbabwe, there is Tajikistan, there is Uganda, Mozambique, Namibia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan. You see many Central Asian countries, right? Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. What else? What about Kyrgyzstan? Yeah, so basically the Central Asian countries are abstaining. And many African countries. What is interesting is that Latin American countries like Brazil or Argentina are not abstaining, so they are supporting the resolution. What is also interesting is that, for example, such countries of Europe like Hungary, which plays a very special game in the EU votings, it also supports the resolution, so there is no abstention. There is abstention by Iran, so Iran is not voting against the resolution, but is abstaining. There are some countries which don't show up, and I think they are repetitively do so, like Azerbaijan didn't vote, Venezuela, Turkmenistan, by the way. Interesting, right? So what it all means? It means, interestingly, that, for example, when we talk about Latin America, we see many Latin American countries who are actually supporting the resolution, like Argentina, like Brazil, like Colombia, like what about Mexico? Mexico as well. What about Chile? Let's have a look. Chile as well, right? So this is an important thing for Russia, because we know that there are big traditions of Russian diplomacy in Latin America, of this support of the Soviet Union support, this certain anti-Americanism, anti-North Americanism. But we see that many of these countries are actually supporting the resolution. But this block of abstaining countries, in which we see primarily China, India, South Africa, interestingly, Indonesia, which is the biggest Muslim country, voted for this resolution. But these countries, I mean, do you feel that they kind of form a stable bloc right now? Especially what worries me is India.
Yes, I think when it comes to the abstentions, I think that each country has kind of its own story in this respect. For instance, China, I think, apart from the fact that it needs to be balancing in this entire war between not going too belligerent with the West, maybe just yet, but still for the time being it is important, and supporting Russia, which should not be underestimated as China's potential or actual partner in many respects. When it comes to India, of course, this is even more important, or at least no less important, because again, the sheer amount of the population they have and how much impact that way they have on the economy and everything. So that indeed is an interesting situation. When it comes to African countries, yes, that's the major trend, I think, with regard to the war in Ukraine, that they keep abstaining, many of them keep abstaining, and that has led to, we can see how there is this standoff basically between Russia and Ukraine in diplomatic efforts in the continent, how there have been diplomatic tours of Ukraine's and Russia's foreign ministers to Africa, and how we are trying to make a round of scramble for Africa in a way, in diplomatic terms. Of course, very good news is Latin America, as you said. With regard to Venezuela and its being absent, I wonder if it doesn't have anything to do with the fact, with those developments around the oil embargoes that were lifted for Venezuela in order to enable the Western world not to be that much dependent on Russian energy resources. So maybe, again, Venezuela here is some kind of balancing, not supporting Russia because it now has bigger bonds with the West, so to say, but not betraying Russia again just yet. So that's interesting.
Yeah, this is interesting. But coming back to Africa, we see a lot of countries which are actually supporting the resolution, and it's also very, very interesting. We see Algeria, which is abstaining, but we see, for example, if we talk about Maghreb, we see that Morocco supported the resolution, Tunisia supported the resolution, and Egypt, for example, supported the resolution, right? We also have lots of other African countries like Nigeria, for example, or Kenya, or South Sudan, or Rwanda, for example, that supported the resolution. And I think this is also very interesting. interesting thing and important thing, because Russians are really trying to put a stake on this and saying that, look, we are organizing all this anti-colonial world, all this anti-imperialist world, and it should be united around Russia, which is obviously a lie and trying to hide Russia's own imperial nature and colonial nature. But we see that at some aspects it is working, in some others it doesn't.
Yes, true. And by the very list of the countries that you enumerated that supported the resolution and voted for Ukraine, we can see that those countries are either the ones that have the strongest economic bonds with Ukraine, and not only in terms of volume but in terms of nature of which resources are being exported to those countries, like grain. Those are the countries that benefit directly from the grain corridor, for instance, and generally from Ukrainian economy. That way, Ukrainian agriculture. There are also countries that are either democratic countries, like, for instance, within Africa, we could say that Kenya, Rwanda, several others are gravitating towards that end, of the political spectrum, democracy. And of course, there are also interests. Well, not interests, but there are also the influences of Ukraine's partners on African countries, like, for instance, many countries that have ties with France, basically with post-colonial powers, but that have kept bonds with their former metropolises, language bonds, economy bonds, etc. So I think that impacts too.
The biggest exception, of course, is South Africa. So
yes,
we will look at these developments that are also very important. Let us talk about China. So China, we talked about this in our previous episode when we talked about Munich Security Conference. At that moment, China announced that it will publish its peace plan. Now it published its peace plan. So what can you talk about it?
Well, broadly, it can be summarized that the plan reflected the rumors that had been preceding the plan about what it would contain. Generally, the major concern about the plan is that, well, there are several things to be said here. First of all, this is not so much a peace plan as an outline of politics of China with regard to Russia's war in Ukraine. So this is more a position paper than a propoundment of what we should do about peace settlement. Or at least that is how Ukraine and the Western world perceive that. Secondly, as expected, the plan or the position of China is basically more or less sitting on the fence, trying to give a couple of nods to Ukraine and to Russia, so it's not an equivocal position. What's important for Ukraine is that there are several core things that Ukraine can support. It's the principle of the territorial integrity that is written down in this, I will continue calling it as a peace plan, but mind what I said before that. Territorial integrity is important because we understand why China put it there, because it wants the world to see its issues with Taiwan also as the issue of the territorial integrity and Taiwan needing to be included in the territory. So we understand the game here, but it plays into the hands of Ukraine. Also, there are all smaller but still very important things like the need to establish security zones around the nuclear sites, like, for instance, primarily the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the continuance of the grain initiative from Ukraine, which is the current iteration of which is going to expire in, I think, maybe a couple of weeks' time. So all those things are good for Ukraine, but also we understand that there have been some points in this peace plan that not, as I said, towards Russia, like the need to negotiate, the need to create the conditions for a ceasefire. And again, the wording here has been interesting. It's not a quotation, but I think instead of saying that there needs to be an immediate ceasefire and then we negotiate about territorial control, etc., I think the actual wording in the plan is that the parties need to strive to create conditions for the stable ceasefire and peace talks. So again, that is not the direct quotation, but the idea here is that it's not enforcement of, guys, you should stop where you control territories and stop at that, but generally the idea is that this needs to be coming to an end.
Yes, and there is no no point about withdrawal of troops.
Yes.
The key condition for Ukraine is, of course, that Ukraine is ready to negotiate, but when Russia quits the Ukrainian territory, that's including Crimea, including eastern Ukraine. And look, when China talks about sovereignty and territorial integrity, it can be interpreted in many ways. Because for Russia, what is happening, right? Russia's interpretation is that Ukraine has occupied Russian territories. That's as surreal as it might sound.
Yes.
But unfortunately, this is what is happening not only in the minds of Russian propagandists, but in the Russian legal order. Because in the Russian constitutional order, in the Russian constitution, 5 Ukrainian regions are considered as part of Russia, including those territories which Russia did not control, does not control, and is not going to control. For example, the city of Zaporizhia and big parts of the Zaporizhia Oblast, the city of Kherson, big parts of the Kherson Oblast, big parts of the Donetsk Oblast as well. So the problem is, with all these calls for negotiations, is that there is a time bomb written in the Russian constitution. Even if, imagine that there is a settlement and we say that the line, the demarcation line right now, how it goes, it will, have its legal power, and we agree on that. Parts of the Ukrainian territory are now controlled by Russia, and then there is a ceasefire, etc. According to Russian constitution, parts of the Russian territories are occupied by Ukraine, and this means that any peace settlement will open the gates for the new war. So we don't really know what is in this China plan. What does it refer to? Because Russia can say, yeah, we're for territorial integrity. Give us the territories that Ukraine occupied, like Zaporizhia.
Yes, indeed, that sounds quite surreal. I agree. Yes, so I think that is something that can be included in the notion of sitting on the fence when it comes to China. It has provided these vague wordings that seem to be just okay for the major part, but they can be construed in different ways. So it's almost as if China is trying to leave a back door for Russia and for its way of the conflict settlement, of war's settlement.
So there are several interpretations of what China is trying to achieve. The first interpretation is that China actually wants to show itself to this abstaining bloc that we discussed, that it is the only party that wants peace. And we see that this actual interpretation is working quite well in the, let's say, those parts of the world which suffered from the colonialism. When we look at the press as the narratives which are developed in some of these countries, the narrative is that there is a fight between, they might be not sympathizing Russia, some of them. They might be saying that, Russia is an imperial power, no problem, but the West is also an imperial power, Ukraine is a battleground, so there is a big fight between two imperial powers, European imperial powers, and what we should do, we should expect they both weakening, they both fall. And in this situation, China comes in and says, I'm the only one who proposes peace. Neither Russia nor Ukraine nor the West want peace. I'm the only country which wants peace. And therefore, China will be kind of consolidating these countries, which are both anti-Western and maybe anti-Russian, around itself. The second interpretation is that, and we will come back to this now, is that China is actually preparing arms supplies to Russia, primarily artillery and drones are the key factor in this war. It is becoming increasingly the war of drones. And here the positions of Ukraine are extremely weak, I must say. Most of these recognition drones which are on the front line are actually Chinese DJI drones, Mavics and others. And of course, if China proposes the Russia advantage in this aspect, this will create a huge problem. for Ukraine, for the West, etc. What do you think?
Yes, indeed, that will be a problem. And so far, China has already been confronted diplomatically and publicly with several statements that there is information, there is intelligence, that China is pondering on actually delivering arms to Russia, in response to which China has provided, I would say, quite mixed signals. There have been responses that the West is not going to dictate us whether to provide those weapons or not, which is not the kind of answer Ukraine would expect for. We would expect a denial and would be satisfied with a denial. There have also been some denials that, no, we're not doing that for the moment, like you are not telling the truth and your intelligence is all wrong. But that is where this issue with the mixed signals is important, because if indeed nothing had been going on, why would the signals be different? And speaking about China's goals here, I would assume that basically, in the long run, strategically, China needs the new, maybe not the new world order, or maybe ultimately so, but China needs for the different rules of the game established. China wants the rules of the game that would be more, that would be better for its move against Taiwan. It wants the international law not to have that much importance before China goes against Taiwan, for instance. So I would say that strategic goals of China here is to maybe help Russia not to lose, to help Russia make its point, to help Russia tilt this this balance, so to say, between the rude power, brutal power, and international law, for the former to become more important in international relations, for that to create conditions for China to follow in Russia's footsteps, to follow that philosophy that international law has not been able to stop Russia from gaining some territorial gains, geopolitical gains, and so China is going to try and do the same trick.
Yeah, and of course, I think it's learning the experience of the United States in the First and Second World War. Then the best strategy is to abstain from a big conflict and to let other big powers exhaust themselves and maybe enter the war at the final moment with a decisive strike. Maybe this is a strategy, because we really on the one hand we understand that there is a strategic, closeness of Russian and China's regime. They are both authoritarian regimes. They are both considering United States and Europe as their, axiological, ontological enemies. But at the same time, I think it would be more strategic for China to actually weaken Russia and then take benefit from the Russian resources. But right now, you can judge that it is either going in the way that Russia becomes an ally of China, or it is going in the way that Russia becomes, not now, but in a few decades, kind of a battleground between the West and China. This also can happen. But for the moment, unfortunately, the trend is that this conflict is becoming more and more global. This is what Ukrainians were saying from the very beginning, from 2014, that this is not a local conflict. This is a conflict between value systems, between democracies and autocracies. And if this is true, we will see more and more autocracies entering the game, like Iran, like China, on Russia's side. And of course, this will not lead to quick finalization of an end of this war. Let's move on and talk about the rumors which we see from several sources, actually. There was a publication in the German newspaper Bild. There are some other things that I've heard from officials, which I cannot quote, but who are saying that, look, there is a mood in some Western capitals that Ukraine needs to, achieve a big victory this year, or maybe in 6 months, as the newspaper Bild has said. And if that doesn't happen, then Ukraine will be pushed for negotiations. What can we talk about? What can we say about this?
I think that it certainly deserves attention because that speaks about how much the West would like to, in a way, to cap this war, because there need to be some lines, chronological lines drawn in this respect, and those chronological lines depend on the dynamics. If nothing happens in a half a year's time, then the West and basically everyone should be preoccupied with where this is all going and whether it's going anywhere at all. The West has had enough with protracted conflicts, particularly the United States, when it comes to its protected involvement from way back in the day in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and more recently in the Middle East. So there is this. There are some lessons they have learned from from how these things go and how they should not go in Ukraine. So that's why I think that these rumors, they stem from this desire of the West not to let the war protract too much, and also not for it not to spill over into, as you just mentioned when we were talking about China, into a global conflict. Because if parties keep piling up to the conflict and China steps in to different extents and increasingly bigger extents, and when there is the step up of Western support for Ukraine, if that's the case, so it indeed incrementally starts risking becoming a third world war, basically, even if it is a proxy war. Maybe it would not be a direct confrontation between China and the West, but still, the amount of casualties, the amount of weapons stockpiled in a limited territory. So maybe that deadline that you said about six months, this is the deadline that the West is trying to put on the situation and that way to manage it. So we'll see what happens before this deadline, and then we'll leave it at that, and we'll move on.
I think these old deadlines, if they're real, we don't know whether they're real, are actually a very big mistake because what happen? Imagine what happens in 6 months, and we are still on the same line that Russia controls. Some parts of the Ukrainian territory. We sign some kind of ceasefire treaty or peace treaty like Minsk III. Doesn't mean anything because it means only the delay. Russia will prepare itself for the new war. That's what was happening actually after the war of 2014. There is a certain logic of Russian expansionism. Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union role in the world. Therefore, it goes to Middle East, to Syria. Therefore, it goes very, very strongly to Belarus, etc. And of course, the big thing that the Western world, the democratic world, should be thinking of is how to secure democracy, how to help it develop further, not only in Eastern Europe, but also far beyond, in Middle East and in Maghreb and in Africa, etc., etc. And if we talk about this, that, we can sign a ceasefire, then we should be prepared for the new war in 2, 3, 5 years. And this should be in the calculation of the policymakers, this long-term thinking. Okay, let's move forward and see what's happening in the neighborhood of Ukraine. One of the key countries is Belarus. And we can actually say that Belarus is an occupied country. Lukashenko is not a legitimate president. He's a dictator who actually faked the election, then suppressed the Belarusian revolution. Already 3 years have passed, right? But he is facing also with resistance inside. There was an information by Belarusian resistance, by Belarusian partisans, that they actually blew up one of the recognition planes, Belarusian planes, who was actually helping the Russian MiGs on the territory of Belarus, and this was kind of announced officially by these Belarusian partisans that they actually have attacked this airplane with a drone. So what does it mean? Does it mean that Lukashenko will be facing with, more resistance inside Belarus?
Well, that puts him in quite a difficult position because, on the one hand, he tries not to be seen as much of a villain as Putin is seen in the world, but at the same time, now he is well. Obviously, Putin still relies on him on the capacities Belarus can provide for Russia, and now the fact that Belarus does not turn out to be that secure for the Russian military infrastructure, that of course is bad news for Russia. So yes, again, this is a difficult position for Lukashenko. But what I can say is that for Ukraine, it is unequivocally good news because, first of all, the fact that this has been done by Belarusian partisans means that there are movements there, that there is support of Ukraine, and this, by association, signals that Belarusian people are not eager to be embroiled in this war after all, that they don't want to be used against Ukraine. So that is a bit reassuring in terms of how we perceive the threat from the north. And secondly, of course, the very fact that Russian infrastructure can be reached by someone where it is not reached by Ukrainians. This is important because there have been, has been detailed information about the very limited number of this kind of planes that Russia has. I think the ones that are equally qualitative from among this type of planes, there are only maybe 2 or 3 other ones. Of course, I think Russia will send another one, and the system will be reinstated, etc. But what's important here is the very little stack of these planes that Russia has, and the very limited resources it has. So, yeah, that is the conclusion here to draw.
I would not be that optimistic saying that Belarusian people, are right now able to stop the Belarusian-Russian army. Of course, these partisans' actions are very important. They are not that global and wide-reaching, but maybe it can be a sign for Lukashenko, to think twice. But we see that he has increasingly less and less power, and maybe he's just, already a powerless man in Belarus. Maybe he cannot even decide whether Belarus will be engaged officially in the war or not. Interestingly, connecting with our previous topic is that there are going to be 2 visits to China to talk to Xi Jinping, and one is Lukashenko and the other is Emmanuel Macron, President of France. And they are both these visits are interesting. Why? Because Lukashenko is going to talk with Xi, not Putin. Why? I think this is a sign that basically between Russia and China nothing is decided, and therefore Lukashenko is sent like Russia's vessel to test the ground and to prepare some talks. Because if Putin comes, that means that a certain agreement is already reached, of course. And maybe China does not want to show clearly that there is an alliance, right, between the two. And Macron, it seems that he has given up on the idea of talking to Putin. We hope, at least what he said at the Munich Security Conference. But we also understand that Macron is a leader that actually says today one thing and tomorrow the other thing. But maybe there is a try to reach out to China from the Western powers, at least, to make it abstain from any big support of Russia. And in several other topics, briefly, Putin's announcement that it is going to quit a big agreement on arms agreement. What does it mean?
Well, this is all about the optics, about how Russia is trying to present what's going on in Ukraine as the things happening in a broader context. Russia basically tries to prove that this is the conflict between the West and Russia. I think that the primary audience for that, well, it's twofold. The primary audience for that is Russian population, because that to show to your population that things have become so difficult with the West, with the United States, that you are forced to, to go to these great lengths to suspend these kind of treaties. This is something that intimidates the population and thus justifies Russia's own harsh steps in Ukraine and against the West generally. So this is something that Russia needs to consolidate grassroots support in order to move forward and to prepare its population for the dire things to come. And secondly, of course, this is the signal to the West about how Russia allegedly is ready to go belligerent even in nuclear sense. I think that maybe the effectiveness of this step is bigger in the mind of Vladimir Putin than it is in the perception of those who are meant to be intimidated of the West. But still, this is nothing to be trifled with. Of course, this is a threat that this is quite a powerful signal to be included and to be given credit to.
But I think that the threat of the nuclear strike is increasingly less plausible given the China's actually criticism of any possible nuclear moves. So I think now everybody's concerned not so much about the nuclear strike, but about China's involvement, interestingly. So
yes.
the ideas have changed. And maybe the last thing about, Ukrainian neighborhood, about Transnistria, we discussed it a little bit last time. These rumors about, well, not rumors, but information about the preparation of a coup d'etat in Moldova. What can we say about developments in Transnistria?
Well, from where I said, Russia is trying to use this small country for so many different goals in the context of the war with Ukraine. First, it tries to plan a coup d'etat in Moldova to destabilize Ukraine's western front. Then it tries to further escalate the military situation in Transnistria to create preconditions for it to become another hotspot, for there have to be maybe some warfare there or whatever, and for Ukraine to be basically forced to spend some of its resources to divert them from the east and from the south to at least control what is happening in the West. All of a sudden in the West. And the third aspect here is that, of course, Russia needs this for propaganda things, for propaganda efforts, because the picture that Russia is trying to paint here is that, look, this is Ukraine who is preparing something in Transnistria. This is Ukraine who is preparing to conquer it, to demilitarize it, to kill everybody there, whatever, all this nonsense, the usual nonsense that Russia disseminates.